Welcome to Practice DNA, the podcast that teaches you how to set up, build and run your own practice. Sponsored by Icon practice management software. Get anywhere access to your system while saving thousands in upfront costs. Visit iconpractice.com now.
Hi, I'm Matthew Holmes, your host on the Practice DNA podcast. Last episode we looked at the pros and cons of being self-employed versus employed. And if you've decided that self-employed is the way for you to go, we're going to look at how you need to make sure that you set yourself up so that should you have a situation where the tax man comes knocking, you're going to be able to prove that you're self-employed versus being an employee. Now, as always, this isn't legal or accounting advice. You need to seek your own advice for your particular situation, and I'm not a lawyer, so just bear that in mind. Okay. What we're going to run through, though, is a simple checklist that can help you determine whether or not you can justify your self-employed status. Because to be self-employed, you have to fulfill certain criteria. You can't, unfortunately, just say, look, I want to be self-employed and just go ahead and do it. The tax office is going to apply these criteria and work out whether or not you should be employed or not. Okay, so the first thing you need to look at is how do you decide whether or not to carry out the job and what skills you're going to need to bring to bear to carry out that job. Now, when you're looking at healthcare practitioners, that's probably going to be fairly obvious because we all should have the skills that we're required to actually perform the job. Otherwise, you wouldn't be the healthcare practitioner that you are. Okay, and part of your training teaches you how to manage the conditions appropriately that you're presented with. Now, from a sort of more traditional point of view, your employees do the job under the direction and regulation of their employer, who decides what skills are necessary. If you are being contracted as a self-employed person, it's up to you to decide how to do the work and what skills are necessary to do that work. So if you're in a situation where the principal in a practice is stipulating how you go about treating a particular problem or so on, or how you're going to manage things and run your aspect of the business, you may have a little bit of a situation arising where it's going to compromise your self-employed status. The next thing you want to look at is who carries the risk for the job. So if it turns out that your patient doesn't pay, who ends up shouldering the burden? A self-employed person will take that risk. Whereas if your employer or the person that's contracting you takes that risk and you get paid regardless, then that's going to suggest that you're an employee. And that is obviously going to compromise your situation from a self-employed status. So if you're the self-employed person, you really need to be the one that's at very least not getting paid until the patient pays their bills. And quite possibly even you need to be the one that's going to be responsible for chasing up patients if they don't pay. Another thing you also need to look at from that point of view is, can you make a profit or a loss on the situation that you're operating in? Now, employees don't bear that risk. They get paid regardless. So I suppose that links in with what we just sort of were talking about, in that if the patient doesn't pay, you're obviously going to end up taking a loss. And that is something that your employer or the person who's contracting you shouldn't be compensating you for, because that would make you more likely to be an employee. The next thing is that self-employed people usually get to set their own hours. Okay, so you need to look at who actually sets the hours that you are operating in. Does the contractor, does the person who's offering the contract, i.e. the principal in the practice, make available certain times for you within the practice, and then you get to choose the exact hours that you work? I would have thought that's going to suggest that you're more a self-employed person, whereas an employee, their hours are set by their employers and they'll tend to be much more regular. Okay. Also, as part of this, can you choose to accept or decline the work? That would suggest that if you can do that, then that's going to I suppose, make your self-employed status more upholdable, so you're going to be able to defend that position much more readily. Now, point number 4 that we look at is, do you work in more than one location? If you work for more than one practice, that is different practice owners, you're far more likely to be self-employed. If you perform work for just one practice owner, it's much harder to justify that you are actually self-employed as opposed to an employee. So even if you can only do, one or two shifts at another practice, it does make it much easier to justify your self-employed status if you are working out of multiple clinics. So that's not multiple clinics that one practitioner or one person or company owns. This is, if you're working for several different businesses, it becomes much easier to justify that self-employed status. Point number 5 is, do you invoice for your services? Self-employed people invoice the practice owner for their services that they provide rather than being paid a wage. So if you're getting paid a wage, then you're employed. Whereas if you're actually performing the service, you then invoice the practice owner for the services that you've provided, then that's the type of thing that a self-employed person will do. Similarly, point 6, can you set your own fees? If you're setting your own fees, then that makes it, again, is a sort of tick in your favour in terms of self-employed status. If your fees are determined by the practice owner, then that makes it more likely that you're actually an employee. So that's one thing you need to be able to do, is try and set your own fees. Point number 7 is, can you employ subcontractors? Self-employed people should be in a position to employ subcontractors to perform the work for them. Now, this can sometimes produce a difficult situation in a practice, in that obviously quite often for practitioners it's much more personality based, and patients are uncomfortable often in terms of seeing other practitioners, and so employing other people can become much more of an issue. But maybe one way to look at this is, if you're away on holiday, do you have the right to employ or contract a locum to come in to cover your aspect of the practice while you're away? If you do have that, then it's much more likely, or that's going to support your case, that you are self-employed as opposed to just an employee. Whereas if the practice owner says to you, no way, you're not allowed to employ anybody else to come in, then that's something else which is going to compromise your self-employed status. Number 8, you also need to be looking at who's responsible for paying things like insurance, professional memberships, training, CPD costs, etc. If you are the one paying for those as the self-employed person, then that's going to support your status. Whereas if the principal of the practice is paying that, then that is more consistent with you actually being an employee. Now, the last point that we tend to apply is you need to look at who actually supplies the tools for the job. Now, typically a self-employed person is the one who actually supplies the tools that they're going to work with. Now, in a healthcare practice, that may be a bit different in that you have certain equipment, maybe treatment benches and so on, that is provided by the person who is providing the facilities. However, the self-employed person may well still provide things like their diagnostic equipment and other sort of smaller stuff that they're actually going to be using. So that kind of runs through the main sort of criteria that you would use to work out whether or not you are actually self-employed, and certainly perhaps what the tax office and places like that are going to use. But you need to really remember that it's not a clear-cut thing, okay? It's not like you go through and you tick off all these and say, yes, I definitely fulfill all these criteria. It's not just a matter of ticking the boxes. It's more about, whether you're more weighted in one direction or another. And so it's quite a subjective thing. So even though you may actually fulfill most of these criteria here, you may still be defined by the tax office as being an employee. But generally the situation is that if you